The student wants to emphasize the historical significance of Stephen Amos' enlistment date. Okay, so historical significance and also the enlistment date. Okay, so Stephen Amos' enlistment date. Okay, so line 2 is all about Stephen Amos. Was born in the Philippines around 1830. He enlisted in the U.S. Navy in November 1863. So we need to mention the year 1863. Looking through the answer choices, choice B does not talk anything about 1863. Okay, so but choice A, C, and D all talk about 1863, 1863, and 1863. But what's important is to answer the question regarding the historical significance of his enlistment date. So if you read the first line, a small number of the U.S. Navy sailors of Filipino descent served during the U.S. Civil War, 1861 to 1865. And you can see that it's during that Civil War. And how is it important? Both Stephen Amos and Rafael Ignatius are part of this small group of the U.S. Navy sailors of Filipino descent. Okay, so when you talk about that these are few Filipino descent, because that is what's answering the historical significance. So choice A, both Stephen Amos and Rafael Ignatius were U.S. Navy sailors of Filipino descent, but Amos listed in the Navy in 1863, 2 years later than Ignatius. So nothing is wrong about this information. In fact, it matched with the student's note. However, there's nothing historical significance. Just the fact that they enlisted in the Navy. What's so special about this? Nothing was mentioned, so choice A is out. Choice C, Stephen Amos enlisted in the U.S. Navy 1863, making him one of the few sailors of Filipino descent to serve the U.S. Civil War. That actually talks about that match with the line 1, how he's one of the few, rare, but he still served during this time, well before the flood of immigrants to the U.S. So choice C is a good one. Choice D, when Stephen Amos enlisted in the U.S. Navy in November 1863, he joined sailors such as Rafael Ignatius, who had been born in the Philippines. Okay, it only talks about how he and Rafael were part of this small number of U.S. Navy sailors, but nothing significant, nothing important about this enlistment date. How he's one of the few sailors of Filipino descent. Okay, there's nothing about that, so choice D is out. The correct answer should be C.